All right, everyone. Welcome again to today's Work from Home Wednesday workshop. Today's topic is storytelling skills for change leaders. I'm your host, Dave Collins, founder and CEO of Oak and Reads. And let's go ahead and jump right into the content. As is the case, today's workshop is brought to you by Oak and Reads. We're providing regular, free, interactive content as we're all going through a lot of change and uncertainty right now. We wanted to be there for you, our clients, and hopefully potential clients, to help teach you some of the skills that I think are really critical for people as we are reacting in real time to the changes in work, the changes in our lives, and the changes in communication and collaboration skills that we're all experiencing as part of this global pandemic and global shift in the way we're working together and connecting. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to move really quickly. I'm going to do my best to get through the content in a little over 30 minutes, and then I'll answer your questions. Go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A box throughout. Make sure to keep them separate from the chat box, and I'll answer all your questions at the very end. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the reasons why story helps us remember messages. It is an evolutionary skill that we as humans have developed. I'm going to break down some of the reasons why story is such a great framework for getting your message across. Then we're going to talk about best practices for storytelling. We're going to talk about how you can use story to inspire people to take an action. We're going to talk about how you can use story to help people mentally practice taking that action. And I'm going to give some reasons why now, as we're looking to inspire and lead people through change, story might be our best vehicle to get those messages across. We're going to talk about how it's really useful if we can precisely identify what's the message and how can I use a story to get that message to an audience and get them to understand it more deeply. And then we're going to talk about at the end, I'm going to give you an exercise that you can use on your own or you can take back to your teams. Again, I've talked over and over in these weekly webinars about exercises you can do in your weekly team meetings. This is a really good one that's going to help both yourself and your people look at developing what I'll call their own personal story playbooks. All right. So these stories we can tell to reinforce messages that we find ourselves sharing over and over again. I love this quote, and doing some research this week to update some of my storytelling content. I think one of the hardest things about storytelling is finding the stories, right? Understanding what are these aspects of our life, what are these moments in our life that are worth retelling. And I love this quote from Paul Smith, who wrote a great book on storytelling and worth Googling and reading some of his interviews. When something teachable and memorable happens to you, write it down. A great story is about to be born. So I would challenge anyone on this call who thinks they don't have a good story to tell. You have created some story over the course of these last 6, 8, 12 weeks as we're all going through some kind of really remarkable changes. The raw materials for story are there. I'd really encourage you, keep a journal, write down some of these things you're going through. These are going to be the raw materials for stories that you'll tell, honestly, for the rest of your life. So I'll tell an example of a story that happened to me in March. So I was flying to Orlando to go to a friend's bachelor party. We were going to go to Universal Studios Orlando and go to Harry Potter World with a bunch of our best friends from high school. And as I landed in the Orlando airport on March 3rd, I got a text on March 5th, I got a text from my friend Dan. And, I'm walking around in the Orlando airport, which kind of looks and feels a lot like an indoor pool. Got this indoor hotel feel. And I get this text from Dan. Hey, Dave, I miss you. Also, you need to develop how to run remote workshop content as soon as possible because of Corona. This is the beginning of March. I'm still flying on a plane. And he went on, so many industries are canceling travel. So many companies are not going to allow travel. Zoom usage is about to skyrocket. And a lot of leaders are left figuring out how to run stuff remotely. And so Dan is a true mensch. I text him back. He's helped me so much with new ideas. That was essentially the origin story for Work From Home Wednesdays. Landing in an airport, getting these text messages from Dan, almost telling me the future and inspiring me to think about how am I going to react and change the way I connect with my clients right away. So that was Thursday, as you can see on the timestamp there. By Monday, I had sent out an invite to my list of a couple thousand people. By Wednesday, I was launching my first remote working free webinar for my clients. That was a tools and techniques for unexpected remote work. Now, the reason I tell you this story is one, it's the origin story for this webinar you're in right now. So it's a little meta, but also it's an example of how I can show rather than tell the initial reason for doing something. So part of this is a story to show about resiliency. Part of it is about adapting, putting your foot in the ground and making a hard pivot to something new. And I could just talk about how I noticed that there was a need to talk about remote work skills and remote collaboration skills. I could give you 5 bullet points, but giving you some of these visuals, showing that rather than telling it through story is going to give you the reason to remember it. It's going to activate parts of your brain that will trigger much more effectively to get my point across rather than just telling you, yeah, I figured there was a market need for this and I wanted to offer something to my clients. Big difference there. So today we're first going to talk about why stories. Why is this such a good tool to use as opposed to just making an argument? And so within that, I love this book. I highly recommend this book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. I've got a copy of it right here. And we're going to put a link to that in the chat as well. I highly recommend people read it. What they argue in their book is that stories put knowledge into a framework that is more lifelike and more true to our day-to-day existence. And what's great about this is that stories are really effective for getting our point across. We are predisposed to understand basic story frameworks. We've been reading stories quite literally since we were beginning to understand language. And what that does is it means that we have what they put as shelves in our how storytelling works closet. So when someone shares information to us through a story, it follows a logical sequence that we understand. And what that does for us is it actually makes it a whole lot easier for the audience to organize information into what we'll call the storytelling shelves. We already have these learned understandings of story structure. So when you input a message through that structure, it's a whole lot easier for audiences to understand it and then take it to heart. Another thing that's useful about stories is they have characters and people. We are predisposed to connect with characters, people, and human emotions as opposed to bullet points on a slide. So we have this background on human behavior. As a storyteller, we can use story to validate people's assumptions or surprise people. Both, again, activate parts of the brain that are tied to memory that we'll talk about later on. And another reason why stories are great is they drive action. So one really useful, there's some great research on this, I'll share afterwards, about how stories are a great way to share tacit, kind of informal knowledge. Because sometimes it's very easy to share formal knowledge through normal, knowledge sharing techniques, PowerPoints, a memo, things like that. But it also allows people to share some of those assumptions or underlying reasons why in a way that is a little less formal. And it can help show relationships people haven't recognized or unexpected ways to solve a problem. Critically, what we're doing with all these things is stories do 2 things. They simulate and they inspire action. Stories provide simulation in the sense that I'm going to tell you a story about a way someone acted, and that's going to simulate the way I would like you to act if you run into that scenario. They also help drive action and inspiration because they can motivate. You can hear an inspiring story that motivates you to donate to a cause. Or you can hear an inspiring story about someone overcoming some sort of hurdle or disability or obstacle, and that can inspire you to push through something similar in your own life. When you combine both the how to act and the motivation to act, stories are a really powerful tool to get people to change. So that's where we're going to jump into this idea of change, because I'm curious, in the chat box, I'd like people to reflect on this. What's something you're trying right now to simulate to help your team practice? When I ask something like that, I think simulation is something that's really important right now as a lot of us are working virtually. So I think first that comes to mind is this idea of simulating socialization. How can we simulate some of the social acts that we're missing right now by telling stories that light up the parts of the brain that allow us to transport ourselves to those simulations? So examples of how people have gathered together in the past. Those simulations, again, are really helpful to help us think about how we can continue to socialize while virtual. Another thing is, what's something you're trying to motivate your team to do right now? having a story that's an example of how other people in the past have motivated to do this same action, again, can provide some of that inspiration. So when you can do both in the same story, both show how you want people to act and inspire them to do that action, you're really taking advantage of story as something that humans love and crave. So when we talk about this idea of mental simulation, there's a lot of research behind this. And I think this is one of the fascinating things about stories. When you tell a story, you actually inspire people to play along in their head. They start to visualize the elements of your story in their own mind's eye. So stories are both entertaining and instruction. And there's a great study that shows that when you tell someone a story, they actually create a geography of the story in their heads. They create these little mental maps so that when you throw a wrinkle into the story, it's actually more difficult for people if it breaks that map to read that story. Put another way is it actually, when you force a change in their mental map, studies have shown that that change actually affects people's processing. So there's proven that these mental pictures are engaging the parts of the brain that are involved in our imaginations. So great stories provide this simulation of real life. And another set of studies shows that the parts of the brain that light up when we do an actual physical activity are the same exact parts that light up when you simulate it. So this has been really useful in trauma therapy, where, for example, people who are afraid of flying, a trauma therapist will actually invite their patient to close their eyes, and they'll walk them through all the steps of flying, from traveling to the airport, through going through security, to getting buckled up, to letting the plane take off. And in doing that, they're actually lighting up the parts of a person's brain that respond negatively to that situation in real life. But they're practicing it, and they're practicing going through it in a way that's less stressful, but still gives people that muscle memory of practicing going through it in much the same way. So that's why I use that metaphor. The term Chip and Dan Heath use is that stories are actually like a flight simulator for the brain. It's almost as good as actually practicing the thing we are walking someone through with a story. And part of this research shows, and I love this stat, mental simulation is about 2/3 as good as actual practice in terms of improving a skill. This is something that a lot of athletes have found a lot of success with. A lot of athletes will simulate in their own brain going through all of the steps of an upcoming game. Pitchers will imagine in their head pitching every single pitch to every single batter in a baseball game. Golfers will do the same thing. Soccer players, tennis athletes, they'll actually imagine everything in their brain. And that, research has shown, leads over time to really great outcomes of performance. So again, we're not just entertaining, it actually helps people learn, and it's proven to do so. So again, another reason why stories is it allows us to show rather than just giving arguments or telling. So when you think about it this way, when you tell someone an argument, tell someone, I really need you, for example, we're talking about change, I really need you to start adjusting to using Zoom meetings to connect with your team. When you tell someone a reason or an argument, research has shown that it actually ignites the part of the brain that starts a debate. So immediately our brains are wired to start poking holes in arguments, right? That's how we're evolved as humans. However, a story that has the exact same point or moral does the opposite. It invites someone to participate with you. It invites that person to visualize in their brain, to simulate in their brain, what will Zoom meetings look like if you're telling the example of, how a company has gone and made this transition. And what's nice about that is the brain starts customizing that situation to fit that person's life and experience. So you're making the exact same point, but instead of starting an argument, what actually happens is you trick, and I use trick in a nice way, you're tricking the audience's brain to simulate what you're talking about, which immediately starts applying that same lesson to their particular life. So it's a really great way to get people on board with an idea or a change. Tell them a story about how it's happened before. Don't just argue or make the case that they have to do it now. That's that idea of show versus tell. And so for all of that, again, I'm really highlighting some of these key takeaways. I highly recommend reading that Made to Stick book because it goes into really great detail about the research behind some of these takeaways. But again, the point is we're showing rather than telling, and it's a much better way to inspire change by telling a story about how people in the past have changed in a similar way. So let's move on. Again, I said I'm moving very quickly here. Let's get into some of the nuts and bolts about storytelling. Okay, so again, these are things you can do when you've decided, all right, I need to have an example. I need to tell a story to my team. How am I going to pick that story? How am I going to tell it? And how am I going to make sure that it's getting the point I want to across to the audience? So first of all, I want to open up the polling question. So let's get a little temperature check on the audience. Let's launch this poll. How would you rate your ability to tell stories in professional settings? So for example, how good do you feel? How confident are you telling a story in a team meeting, or telling a story at an executive presentation, or maybe even a sales call, or maybe in an interview, right? In a professional setting where you're being judged, not necessarily on your storytelling skills, but in a message you're trying to get across. Let's leave this open for another 10 seconds or so to get everyone a chance to chime in. All right, I've got almost everyone here. I'm liking these results. Okay, 5 seconds left. Get your vote in, otherwise one demerit. Okay, ending the poll. So let me share these results. Pretty interesting. Nice bell curve here. Looks like people feel fine. Some people, excellent. Glad you're here. Hopefully you're picking up some new stuff. Most people feel good. Glad to hear no one feels terrible about it. Otherwise, we'd have to have a separate conversation. Hopefully by the end of this workshop, you'll have moved one step forward. Maybe you go from fine to good, from poor to fine, or maybe we get a lot of people feeling excellent about taking some of these tools on. All right, let's keep moving. I have 4 best practices for you when it comes to thinking about planning to tell a story at work or in a professional setting. So the first one is this idea of mining your personal experiences for the raw materials. So when it comes to mining your experiences, this was part of the prompt question I asked you at the opening of this webinar. Where do you go for the idea, the kernel of the story I'm going to start telling? So I think the best place to start is look for the emotional moments in your life. And right now, you're probably feeling a lot of emotions dealing with all the changes going on right now. So I think as a change leader, you can pull from the emotions you're feeling or have felt over the last couple months in adjusting to this pandemic. So thinking about moments where you're really happy or hopeful, where things were going your way, thinking about moments where you were worried or frightened or scared, thinking about moments where you're really inspired or excited to do something new, or even where you're angry or frustrated. Again, we talk a lot about previously on the change curve, a lot of these emotions show up at different moments in a change. You can almost start to develop a different story for each moment in the change curve to talk about how you've adjusted and how you process that. Again, really useful to show rather than tell to help someone move through that curve. So this is kind of relating to a previous webinar we've done. Even moments where you're embarrassed or ashamed or sad or feeling not great. Even negative emotions, if you can tell the story about how you got there and how you got out of that moment, again, you're not feeling it today, so hopefully it won't be as triggering, but it can be really useful to show people how they can simulate in their head making the steps forward to get through some of these difficult moments in a change. Take a real moment from your life, tell it from the first person. There is guaranteed to be a story here if you have these strong emotional moments. Because again, great stories have really powerful emotional changes in their characters. And in the case of a story about you, pick a moment where you've changed your emotions. I guarantee you it'll be a compelling story for a listener. The next thing we want to think about with story is some of the science behind storytelling. Again, we hit on this a little bit in the first section of some of the research, but when it comes to brain chemicals and neuroscience, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've done some reading and there's some cool findings here. One of the great parts about using story is when you tell a story to an audience member, it releases dopamine in their brain. And this, I hope, is an image of what dopamine looks like on a chemical structure. I'm pretty sure it is. And dopamine, again, is that chemical, we've probably heard of it, It's the pleasure chemical. It's the chemical that's released in our brain when we feel excitement and pleasure. It's the chemical that makes us enjoy movies or a great book or why we love to listen to someone tell stories. The more excitement and the more interesting your story, the more dopamine is released in the listener's brain. So that's why boring stories aren't nearly as effective as exciting, memorable stories. And what's cool about dopamine is the more dopamine that's released in the brain, the more likely it is that the audience will remember that story. That's why you remember a great book, but some boring books or maybe stories you were required to read that you didn't want to in high school, you don't remember them as well because it didn't go and coincide with the dopamine release of pleasure. Another important thing with story is it releases oxytocin both in the brains of the storyteller and in the audience. And oxytocin is what's called, the love chemical. It's the chemical that's released when we're forming bonds with each other. So another really great benefit of story is that in telling a story, you increase the bonds, you increase that oxytocin release amongst the people who are there to hear it and to tell it. So it's, again, a great way to continue to build some of these bonds. You still get that oxytocin release if you're telling things virtually, right? You're building that connection. And finally, third, I want to really encourage people to focus on sensory details when we are telling stories. This is often something that people forget or think is a little too squishy for a professional setting. You think, okay, I'm telling a story at work. I really need to make it just about the facts, the bullet points. This is what happened, and that's what happened, and that's what happened. Unfortunately, when you don't engage the senses, you don't light up the parts of the brain that are the simulation part. So you don't get a lot of the benefits of storytelling if you're not inviting the listener to imagine and understand the description that you're providing to them. So in fact, you actually want to turn up the dial and increase the amount of sensory details you're including in your stories, especially at work, because you're going to get a lot of those simulation benefits for your people. So make sure you remember all those 5 senses and build in some of these descriptors into your story. Talking about what things looked like, sight. Talking about the sounds of a situation, right? The sound of the subway car on your way to your first day of work at your first internship. Talking about the smell, the new car smell of that, of the leather couch as you were waiting for your interview for your first law firm job. Or the taste of the really bland turkey sandwich they gave you in between interviews, right? Or even you could use taste metaphorically. I could taste in my mouth how dry my tongue was. I was so nervous walking in for that first presentation. The touch, I felt the papers in my hand. My palms were sweaty, right? Like that Eminem song, right? All these things are such great sensory details. And finally, the thinking mind is what we'll call a 6th sense, non-ghost category of a sensory detail that's really useful, especially when you're talking about stories from your perspective from the past. The thinking mind sense is really, what were you thinking in your brain in that moment, in that story? This is especially useful if you're telling stories from childhood, where it's helpful for us to get in the mind of a child to see the world through their eyes. So don't forget to include kind of what's going on in your brain. That can, again, allow us to transport the audience to get those simulation benefits for all of the listeners of that story. And so finally, the last thing I want to talk about here is the story spine. So a lot of times we struggle as storytellers to make sure our story has a clear beginning, middle, and end. A lot of times I do this workshop and people complain that I start telling a story and then I don't know where it's going and I lose track of where it's supposed to go, and I can't, to again use that plane metaphor, I struggle to land the plane and make sure it has a clear ending with a clear point. So what I like to teach is what's called the story spine. This is basically a basic structure that every story can follow. And if you follow this structure and you have it in the back of your head, it makes sure that your story will have all the critical elements that are engaging to people, and it basically forms the outline to your plot. This follows a lot of similar tools like the hero's journey, and there's a lot of different versions of this. I like this one because it's super simple and it's really easy to remember. and something that you can practice on your own or with your team. So a great story always starts with once upon a time. This is the beginning of the story where you set the stage. And essentially, you're trying to make sure the audience understands what is the world like as this story begins. What was going on in the company? What was going on in the economy? What was going on in my family, right? Depending on the story, you kind of need to set a little context. Then every day, this is essentially where you talk about what was going on in the world of the main character. For the examples we're talking about today, the main character is you, right? So what were you doing every day? If we're thinking about the story of your first job, you can think about every day I woke up, applied to 10 job listings, and I was really frustrated, right? Again, talking about what were you like? What was the main character doing before this story really kicks into action? Then we have what's called in some circles, the inciting incident. But one day, this is where something changes. Either something changes in the world, something changes in the character's mind, or in a relationship the character has. This is where things really kick into action. So you have to be really clear is what was the world like before? And then what's the inciting incident that gets us into this world, right? So I think, but one day, if we're talking about this job search example, which I'm making up as I go along here, but one day I got a reply from a recruiter saying I was a perfect fit for a job. And here's where the plot starts to accelerate. Because of that, something happened. Because of that, something else happened. And because of that, another thing happened. All right, there can be 3 because of that. There could be 59 because of that in a really long novel. But what's critical here is that each plot point leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. You want to make sure that your rising action is leading towards your climax. This is often where a lot of people lose track because it's really, they're just listing things that happen instead of listing things in an order that makes sense. This is, again, we're going back to that idea of stories are a framework that we all understand. We as humans understand how plot rises. If your plot points are all disconnected, that's really a problem. So this is why this, because of that, leads you sequentially to your climax. So let's go to the example. But one day I got an email from a recruiter saying I was a perfect fit for a job. Because of that, I had a phone interview. Because of that phone interview, I was invited in to meet with all of my potential coworkers and my hiring manager. Because of that, my hiring manager and I formed a really strong bond until finally I was hired. And so again, this is the story of meeting your mentor, let's say, until finally I was hired. And ever since then, I've had a phenomenal mentor in my manager that I met that day. And I've learned so much from their leadership and guidance. So here's the thing. Until finally is the climax. That's the top of the action. That's where you defeat the dragon. That's where, Harry learns. I can't remember Harry Potter right now, but anyway, you get the point. And then ever since then, that's the resolution. So what is different about the world or about the character at the end of this story? Really important to make sure it's clear how things are different. In my first job story, what's different is I have a mentor and I've learned a lot from that person, right? Once you get to the end, it's important to state the moral of the story. What's the key takeaway that you want people to remember? This is often where if you didn't do a great job telling your story and it's unclear, you can really get away with a poorly told story as long as you make it really clear that the moral of this story is persistence. The moral of this story is all changes come to an end. You can literally just say the moral out loud. And again, it reinforces what the point of that story was. So again, following those 4 tools will help you deal with some of the big basic pitfalls that a lot of us feel are insurmountable when we're just getting started telling stories. If you use sensory details, if you follow a basic structure, if you use emotional moments that show change, and you make sure that your stories are exciting and you don't leave that stuff out, you're going to tell a good story, right? It doesn't have to be the most amazing story in the world, but if you follow those best practices, it is going to get you some of those simulation and inspiration benefits that help you show rather than tell your point. So with those in mind, let's put it all together. Let's do what I'll call filling up your personal story playbook. And now, as a change leader, what I want you to be thinking about are, I'm going to give you some of these examples of types of story. what are the types of stories you want to start telling to either show your people how you'd like them to act in a new post-change world, or also how can you simulate how people in the past have gone through these changes to, again, give people some of those benefits of practice, even when they're not even yet practicing it. They're just listening and playing along in their heads. So when we think about personal story playbook, don't worry about writing brand new stories. It's more about discovering them in the world, either in your life, your history, or out there. There are plenty of examples of stories out there. With this framework, will hopefully help you search for them a little more effectively. And then it just comes down to practice. Practice, practice, practice. That's always going to be important for storytelling. But the nice part is you don't have to learn 1,000 stories. You can really just tell a handful of stories over and over again, just getting comfortable adjusting them depending on the audience and depending on the point you want to make. So when we think about stories, I think it's really important to think about what are some of the types of stories. And again, we're going back to the Made to Stick book for some examples here to help us get organized. A really basic kind of story that can be helpful is an origin story. This is where we came from, right? This is where we're getting insight on what we've learned from something. So again, telling the origin story of how we got to 100% remote work is something you are going to want to start to practice. The origin story of Work from Home Wednesdays is that Orlando airport story I just told you, right? So how do we get to where we are today? Impact stories, thinking about customer impact. Case studies are the classic example of an impact story. What have you done for a customer? What have you done for a client? You still can tell that in a very compelling story format, rather than just 5 bullet points about ROI and impact and how much revenue you've driven for a customer, right? So showing rather than telling the great work you're doing. You also may want to think about vision stories. So this is a story where you're starting to dip your toe a little bit into fiction, but you want to start showing where we're going to be. Again, I talked about this in the change management workshop around setting a vision. Really difficult right now to tell a vision story. Instead, it may be useful to look at what are some examples of companies or organizations or teams, or maybe non-business examples of companies that have done the thing already that we're trying to do. Companies that have gone fully remote, companies that have totally upended their business model to respond to an economic crisis. Those can be vision stories for you. And again, you may want to start to assemble some of those if you are going through some of those changes, that you can show people how they've done it. Again, kind of inspiring people, but also showing them how to get it done. And finally, another type of story, I really like this example from their book. It's what this is called the springboard story. It's kind of a mishmash of a couple of these, but essentially a springboard story is a type of story that shows how another person has looked at a similar problem to you and thought about it in a new creative way, right? So how other businesses have taken your same challenge and used it to drive innovation. Really useful. Another way to think about a type of story that you may want to start to collect. Within each of these stories, there are really basic plots. So again, this may be a review, but you want to think about what are some of those plot points that I'm going to plug into the story spine to make sure people understand how things changed at the end. So a classic plot is a challenge plot. Overcoming a big challenge and succeeding. You know, probably the most famous challenge plot, David and Goliath, right? David, I'm obviously, I like that story because it's the same name as me, but also it's showing how you can overcome a big challenge that no one believes in you by, you know, getting a slingshot, hitting that giant right in the face. Another type of plot, the connection plot. People forming unexpected relationships, two unexpected ideas coming together that bridge a gap or solve a problem. Classic connection plot, Romeo and Juliet, right? People from two houses, always warring, and they formed a phenomenal relationship that ended poorly, but I just spoiled it for you. Again, classic examples of these throughout, but you're showing how unexpected relationships and coming together can bridge a gap or solve a problem. Creativity plots. Right? This, again, similar to the springboard story, kind of go hand in hand, attacking a new problem in a new creative way. I think about, you know, the story of Archimedes discovering volume in the bathtub, right? He plops in the bathtub, it overflows. Eureka, I understand how we have volume as humans. So again, rethinking things. There's so many examples of people breaking stuff and actually discovering something brand new. Another classic one is 3M, right? Inventing the sticky note, right? They thought they were trying to make a glue. They thought the glue wasn't strong enough, but eureka, we've invented something we never even thought that we needed. So lots of examples of these throughout business literature. And so with those two things, you want to think about what is the type of story I want to tell? What's the type of plot that's getting the message across? And ultimately, what's the key takeaway, right? What's the message I want this audience to get from my story? You need to make sure you have all those things really clearly in your mind. It's going to help you tell that story to get that point across more clearly. Otherwise, you're just telling a story for telling a story's sake rather than using it to inspire change. So again, for all of these, we're trying to get that simulation part of the brain fired up so we get the benefits of practice just through story. And so there may be a lot of morals that you're trying to impart on individuals, and key takeaways, right? Showing what leadership looks like, flexibility, what diligence and work ethic, showing empathy, how that's really important, showing what focus and character looks like, showing what coachability and adaptability look like. There's lots of examples of stories that you can show to inspire people to take on some of these traits. Also, if you're working with a team, you may want to think about some of these as some of the key takeaways, showing what teamwork looks like, pressure, showing what it means to be driven in a difficult environment, team discipline, what it looks like when a team overcomes adversity or takes on a new challenge, what it looks like to be creative, right? That 3M example is showing creativity in an example of a story. Dealing with uncertainty. So a lot of these are very critical skills and morals that we're trying to get our teams to practice right now as we're all going through a major change. And so what's really useful for you to think about right now, and again, feel free to put this in the chat or just reflect to yourself, what are the key takeaways? What are the traits for individuals or teams that you want to make sure people are practicing right now as we're going through these major changes? Right? Again, how can we show and inspire people to take on new skills, to take on new challenges, to work in new ways? How can we use story to show those changes? How can we use short story to show how to overcome some of the emotional challenges dealing with these changes? And again, there may be something I'm not listing. What are the other key takeaways you want to be the moral of your story? How can you take the things that were as bullet points on a PowerPoint slide and turn them into an example that gets you a lot of those benefits of story that we talked about at the beginning? So here's the exercise I'll leave you with, and this is the end of my presentation. And I will share all these slides with you afterwards. So don't worry, the recording of this webinar will be available so you can pull from this and use it. I'd love to hear how you're using it as well. This is called the personal story playbook exercise. I do this in all of my storytelling workshops. Normally this takes a little while. Give yourself 20, 30 minutes to help people think through this. But what I want you to do is challenge people to pick a true story from their life. And if they can't pick a true story, right, go back to that idea of pick a moment where you felt a strong emotion. There's a story there. But I would challenge people who say they don't have any story worth telling, because we've all probably developed a bunch of stories just in the last month. Then with that story, let's start to think about what are the points you're trying to make? How can we craft it and sand the edges to make sure that it fits in one of the categories we're talking about? So what kind of story is it? Is it an origin story? Is it a vision story about showing where we want to go? Is it an impact story to talk about great work we're doing? Like, kind of what's the general theme? What kind of plot are we going to use, right? Is this a challenge, people overcoming something difficult? Is it a connection where we're forming relationships or bonds? Or is it an example of something really creative that we've come up with that we wouldn't have thought of previously? And then critically, what's the takeaway, right? What are we trying to impart on our teams? What are we trying to show rather than tell? It is very important to come up with answers to these questions before you start telling a story. But on the flip side of that, if you have clear, concise answers to these, telling the story becomes really easy because you know exactly what types of evidence and examples to use that help make your point clearer and help make your point more exciting. And then what you can do, just have people partner up to practice telling the story. So encourage them to use the story spine just to tell the basic outline of the story. And the nice part about having a partner is challenge the partner to listen for the takeaways, right? Don't tell them up front. tell the story, and then ask them, what do you think is the point or the moral of this story? Have a little feedback conversation. What's really cool about doing this exercise, I've noticed over the last few years that I've done it, a lot of times the key takeaway isn't even something that the storyteller believes is part of the story, but just in hearing it, getting that immediate feedback and saying, you know what, that's actually, it is an overcome adversity story, but really what it is it's about forming new relationships in a crisis. And the storyteller is often really taken aback by the takeaways. And it's just a useful way to get instant feedback to help them realize that there may be actually more deeper, stronger, more powerful underlying messages in that story that they haven't even seen just because they're too close to it, because it may be something that they've gone through. So again, having that dialogue is really important, and then getting both people to share that story. This is something I highly encourage you to do in your team meetings. If you're looking for something to both help people build a skill and also help take up some of that social aspect that we're missing right now, this is a great way to, again, like I mentioned earlier, build some of that oxytocin release in your people's brains to help strengthen existing bonds that may be really stressed right now because we're all separate from each other and we don't get a chance to kind of, tell the classic story, what happened over the weekend, right? We're not getting that oxytocin release that's bringing us together by the coffee maker conversations. So again, we have to add structure, we have to plan this, but we can still get a lot of benefits, both just within our teams by practicing some of these story skills. All right, that's it for me. I would love to answer some questions. So if you have some questions right now, go ahead and type them into the chat box. But before you go, I want to leave you with this. Go ahead and follow us on social media. We have a lot of good content. We're putting out videos now, snippets from our webinars. So really useful if you want to follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, follow us on LinkedIn. We're at Oak and Reads everywhere. We will be sharing this video with you. It'll be going up on YouTube is where we're going to be putting them all now, but you can always find everything on our website, oakandreads.com/remote work. All the links to all the past webinars are there as well. We're going to be doing another webinar in 2 weeks. We're going to take next week off to start to think about some new content, some brand new stuff. So if you have ideas about what you might like us to talk about, please email me. Either put it in the chat right now, email me at dave@oakandreads.com. The suggestions we've been getting are phenomenal, and I'm really trying to start to put those together more formally for the next one in 2 weeks on the 20th. And finally, I am offering a free 30-minute consultation for you, the audience, to help you think through some of these remote work challenges. I've already had some folks take me up on this, and I had some really good conversations. So if you would like me to talk with your C-suite, to talk with your leadership team, to talk with your learning team, I'd love to share and help you think through how you can continue to support your team working remotely. So just go ahead and you can just schedule 30 minutes using this link, and I'm excited to meet you one-on-one. All right, so I will go ahead and answer the questions right now. Otherwise, I'll see you next week if you're not going to stick around. Let me stop the sharing. All right, first question. How much showing, storytelling, as opposed to telling in meetings do you recommend? Yeah, I guess it depends on the meeting. And I think it's a good question. I would say one really good example or rule of thumb is I like to open up meetings with a story. So I wouldn't go overboard, especially if you're new to this, but I think telling a 2-minute story at the beginning of a meeting is a really great way to get people immediately engaged and show, again, that this meeting may be a little bit different. So I wouldn't recommend, in an hour-long meeting, just telling a 40-minute story. That's probably not that useful. Telling a 2 to 3 minute story at the beginning of a longer presentation, I think is a great way to gain audience engagement and buy-in and not overwhelm people with a long story, especially if they're not used to it. So I think that's a great question. And try to keep your story short, right? 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Don't have them go long, especially if you're new to this. You're going to be really successful at the beginning if you keep them short and sweet using that story spine. Again, 30-second, 1-minute story can be really impactful. It doesn't have to be 10, 15 minutes. All right. So it looks like that's it for questions. Again, thanks so much for coming today. And I'm excited to see people next week. Again, we're going to announce that workshop topic next week. But if you'd like to sign up right now, I think it'd be really useful. We're going to put that registration in the chat. I think we already have, but we'll repost it. Go ahead and sign up now, and you'll get an update about what the topic is when we release it next week. Otherwise, best of luck with your storytelling. Email me if you have questions. Otherwise, we'll see you in 2 weeks at the next Work From Home Wednesdays. Have a good one.